Welcome, everyone. I'm Henry Louis Gates Jr. I have the pleasure of being the director of the Du Bois Institute and of the Hutchins Center, which houses the Du Bois Institute. And one of the great pleasures of the academic treats of the Du Bois Institute is our lecture series. And so Abby and Christian and I couldn't imagine what we're going to do. You know, we had this backlog of brilliant lectures with the COVID shutdown. And like everyone else, we said, we'll go virtual. And as many of you know, traditionally our lectures are given one lecture over the course of 3 days, followed by food and drink in the back of the room, and then an elaborate dinner at Benedetto's or wherever. Stuart, I'm sorry, you lost out on 2 out of the 3 of those treats. But the benefit of going virtual is that the size of our audience is phenomenally larger. At the most, Abby told me a few minutes ago, we could get 75 people in the Thompson room. And now we have over 1,200 people, I think, online, eager to know about Egypt and the never-ending question of what color were the Egyptians, and tell me about the Pharaohs, and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's going to be my first question to you. It's like, why? You know, why is Egypt endlessly captured? But I just rushed back from New York for my annual physical. The driver and I had a bet if he could get me here at 4 o'clock. I almost lost my stomach, but I lost the bet. But I'm so glad to see you. And I'm so glad that you're safe out there in California, and that the fires have abated, and that you can see the sky. I love your work so much, as you know, and I'm really, really glad that this worked out. For those of you who don't know, in our modified lecture series, a person will be giving 1 lecture, and then they will work with Harvard University Press about the rest of the lectures, the other 2, and what other supplemental materials that they want to deliver, so that this will be part of a book, I guess, a new book series called the Du Bois Institute Virtual Lecture Series in print, to mark this peculiar moment in the history of our crazy country and civilization. So now it's my pleasure to turn this over to the executive director of the Hutchins Center, Dr. Abby Wolf.
Thank you, Skip. Welcome everyone to the very first, as Skip said, of our W.E.B. Du Bois virtual lecture series. We are thrilled to have Stuart Tyson Smith with us today, kind of starting us off in a most appropriate way with an ancient topic. And he'll be speaking to us on the Black Pharaohs, Egyptological bias, racism, and Egypt and Nubia in African civilizations. But first, it's my pleasure to introduce one of Harvard's own stars in the field, Peter Dermanuelian. He is the Barbara Bell Professor of Egyptology, the director of the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East, and director of the Giza Project. So he'll share a few words and observations on Professor Smith's work, and I hope you'll enjoy what we're offering today. At the end, we will do a Q&A with the audience. We ask you to put your questions into the Q&A box. We'll remind you of that in the chat, but the chat is disabled for this talk. So thank you very much, and Peter, over to you.
Thanks, Abby, and thanks to Skip as well. It's tremendous to have so many people join us today, 1,200 people, just fantastic. And that shows just how important this topic is, not just for Egyptology, but of course for the much wider context of the very troubled times that we find ourselves in these days. I'm happy to introduce Stuart Tyson Smith for the very first W.B. Du Bois virtual lecture series at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. Currently, he serves as Professor of Anthropology and Director of the Institute for Social, Behavioral, and Economic Research at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He's an active field archaeologist with expeditions to Egypt and, since 1997, to Sudanese Nubia. Professor Smith's research focuses on the civilizations of ancient Egypt and Nubia, with a particular interest in the identification of ethnicity in the archaeological record and the ethnic dynamics of colonial interactions with those civilizations. Since receiving his PhD from UCLA, Professor Smith has written several books, including Wretched Kush, Ethnic Identities and Boundaries in Egypt's Nubian Empire, 2003, and A Scoot in Nubia, The Economics and Ideology of Egyptian Imperialism in the Second Millennium BC. That was 1995. Among his many academic honors, he was invited to give the 2017 Mikhailovsky Memorial Lecture to the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities in Tourism in Cairo. While his scholarship is well known internationally, what you may not know is that back in 1993, Professor Smith went to Hollywood to serve as Egyptological consultant for the popular movie Stargate. And he later returned to Hollywood to consult on the 1998 movie The Mummy and its sequel, The Mummy Returns. Who said Egyptology doesn't have its practical applications? He may not recall this, but I personally remember him very kindly picking me up at the airport in LA for a lecture many years ago and telling me how one of the Stargate actors, who shall remain nameless, couldn't remember his lines in ancient Egyptian to save his life. But back to the very timely and important topic of today's lecture, please join me in welcoming Stuart Tyson Smith on Black Pharaohs, Egyptological bias, racism, and Egypt and Nubia as African civilizations. Stuart.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Oh, PowerPoint one. There we go. So before I start, I'd just like to thank Skip and the Hutchins Center for inviting me to give this presentation, and just to say what a great honor it is to be inaugurating the W.B. Du Bois virtual lecture series. I'd also like to dedicate this talk to Laszlo Torok, who passed away on Thursday. He was a wonderful man, a brilliant scholar, and an advocate for treating Kush and more broadly Nubia on its own terms. Our lives were enriched by knowing him, and his contributions to Nubian studies were profound and an inspiration to me. In the 8th century BCE, the first Kushite rulers were coronated as kings of Egypt of Thebes, ruling a combined Nubian and Egyptian kingdom as pharaohs of Egypt's 25th dynasty. Ancient Kush, or Nubia, extended from the area around modern Khartoum in Sudan, at the bottom of the map here, through the first cataract at Aswan in southern Egypt. The first Kushite pharaoh was likely Kashta, who around 760 BCE was acknowledged as king in southern or upper Egypt and adopted Egyptian royal titulary. He was followed in 747 BC by Tianki. He subdued a northern rebellion in 727 BCE and solidified the new dynasty's control over the Nile Delta. The Kushite pharaohs of Egypt ruled for around 100 years until Tutankamoni was finally pushed out by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, the culmination of decades of conflict. However, the kingdom of Kush survived in Nubia and thrived for another 1,000 years, defeating attempts at conquest by Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans. These Kushite kings are commonly referred to as the Black Pharaohs in both scholarly and popular publications. This terminology is often presented as a celebration of Black African civilization, as in this National Geographic article. But the phrase itself begs and answers the question of ancient Egyptian origins, not Black and not African. This framing of Nubian civilization also reflects a long-standing Egyptological bias that defines Kush with respect to Egypt. In contrast to the imagery that the Black Pharaohs conjures up, the Kushites did not simply take on the mantle of Egyptian civilization. Instead, they selectively adapted aspects of Egyptian kingship and other cultural features, making them their own without abandoning local traditions. Egyptologists have been strangely reluctant to admit that the ancient Egyptians were rather dark-skinned Africans, especially the farther south one goes, and in the end not so different from Nubians in terms of phenotype. Ultimately, the mapping of a modern racial divide onto an ancient context through the Black Pharaohs terminology and its implied juxtaposition of African Kushites and not African Egyptians, however well intended, feeds into a long history of racism that goes back to some of the founding figures of Egyptology. George Glidden's collaboration with anthropologist Samuel Morton and slavery advocate Josiah Nott in the 1840s and 50s, especially Nott and Glidden's 1854 book, Types of Mankind, established the basis for scientific racism in the United States. As Scott Trafton has outlined in his book, Egyptland, Egyptology has largely been tone deaf to the real significance of this debate and its centrality to African-American scholars like the great W.B. Du Bois. Drawing on some of my own research in northern Sudan, I will first turn to the question of ancient Egypt as an African civilization. Then, with examples from our ongoing excavations at Tombos, I will discuss Kushite civilization as not just a reflection of Egypt, but as a sophisticated African neighbor with a long history of intercultural interaction and mutual influence. Within these discussions, I will take Egyptological bias and racism into consideration, and will conclude with some remarks on why it is important in the context of anti-racism today to acknowledge the African foundation and origins of both Egypt and Nubia. At first glance, the notion of Egypt as a Middle Eastern and not an African civilization seems reasonable. In the context of 19th and 20th century Western colonialism, the discipline of Egyptology was incorporated into the broader field of Near Eastern or Oriental studies. Modern Egypt is generally placed in a Middle Eastern context, and Egyptians tend to identify as Arab, although the question of identity in Egypt is complex, and issues of racism and color prejudice are being highlighted in Egypt and the Middle East today in the context of the global movement sparked by Black Lives Matter. In the end, not only Egypt, but North Africa was largely ceded by Africanists to a concept of a broader Middle East, with some notable exceptions like Chris Arrett, who gave a series of Huggins lectures last year. Moreover, the ecology of Northeast Africa seemed to support the separation of Egypt from the rest of the continent. Herodotus, or rather originally Hecataeus, famously said that Egypt was the gift of the Nile. This observation seems as valid today as it did 2,400 years ago. The fertile Nile Delta, formed by the accumulation of silt deposited by the river, still bulges out into the Mediterranean. Stretching southwards, strips of cultivation made possible by the annual flood, and today by irrigation, border the barren Sahara and mountainous eastern desert, creating a stark contrast between desert and river. Taking their cue from these modern conditions, early Egyptologists like James Breasted wrote, and I quote, "Thus sharply defined was the Egyptian's world, a deep and narrow valley of unparalleled fertility, winding between lifeless deserts, furnishing a remarkable environment not to be found elsewhere in all the world." Even recent publications frame ancient Egypt's ecological setting in similar terms. For example, Van der Meerup observes in 2011, "Where are the borders of ancient Egypt? Arabic speakers today use the same name for the modern country of Egypt as did the people of the Near East in the millennia BC, Masr. We can better envision the borders of ancient Egypt by using a starting point, what is and always was the lifeline of the country, the Nile. Hemmed in by deserts and the sea, Egypt had a degree of isolation many other countries lacked," end quote. This perception of isolation is tied to the colonial era reification of a fundamental cultural and racial ethnic divide between Saharan and sub-Saharan Africa that was used to justify imperial domination and reinforce racist constructs of superior light and inferior dark peoples. The way he invokes the Semitic term for Egypt, which the ancient Egyptians never used themselves, resonates with the biblically derived and now discredited Hamitic hypothesis, which considered North Africans, including ancient Egyptians, as Caucasians with Middle Eastern connections. And you can see in the blue across the northern and eastern part of Africa. Even worse, it resonates with George Gliddon's racist views of the ancient Egyptians. Gliddon supplied Egyptian skulls to Samuel Morton for measurement and hierarchical racial typing, urging him in 1841 to support his notion of Egyptian origins in Western Asia, and I quote, "I am hostile to the opinion of the African origin of the Egyptians. I mean of the high caste, kings, priests, and the military. I urge your pausing and considering why the Egyptians may not be of Asiatic and perhaps of Arabic descent. At any rate, they are not and never were Africans, still less Negroes," and end quote. Van der Meerup unconsciously echoes this position when he asserts of the ancient Egyptians, and I quote, "The relationship with other African peoples is not obvious, as is true of Egypt's overall contacts with the rest of Africa. While ancient Egypt was clearly in Africa, it was not so clearly of Africa. The contributions of Egypt to other African cultures were at best ambiguous, and in general, Egypt's interactions with Asiatic regions were closer and more evident," end quote. This all too common argument is also tied to the dynastic race theory, first formulated at the end of the 19th century by Egyptologist and archaeologist William Matthew Flinders Petrie. Petrie argued that pharaonic civilization was brought to Egypt by a new race of people from the north. As late as the 1950s, anatomist Douglas Derry restated Petrie's notion, noting that the invaders from the north, noting that the invaders were not from the south, since their skulls did not have Negroid characteristics, but more likely came from the east, in other words, the Near Eastern Europe. Implicitly aligning himself with Morton, Knott, and Glidden, Derry argued that the skulls were, and I quote, very suggestive of the presence of a dominant race, perhaps relatively few in numbers, but greatly exceeding the original inhabitants in intelligence, a race which brought into Egypt the knowledge of building in stone, of sculpture, painting, reliefs, and above all writing, hence the enormous jump from the primitive pre-dynastic Egyptian to the advanced civilization of the old empire, end quote. This idea was still espoused by Walter Emery in the early 1960s, who repeated the idea of a master race responsible for Egyptian civilization. To be fair, Emery's position was criticized at the time, but the attitude remains in the pervasive assumption that ancient Egypt and the Egyptians were not African in origin, but instead represent a Near Eastern civilization and people, a theme that the Black Pharaohs terminology reinforces. There were a few early voices that rejected the notion of Egypt as a Near Eastern civilization. Writing in 1911, E.A. Wallace Budge drew on African ethnography to inform his understanding of ancient Egyptian religion, seeing similarities with contemporary practices among nilotic cultures as evidence for an indigenous Northeast African origin, like the Dinka here, particularly cattle symbolism. However, as Reed points out, this seemingly progressive view was undermined by Budge's contempt for primitive Egyptian religion. He thought monotheism was the way to go, polytheism not so much. Henry Frankfurt was perhaps the most remarkable. In 1948, he argued that in order to understand Egyptian kingship and religion, one should use the ethnography of the, and I quote, groups of people who are the true survivors of that great East African substratum out of which Egyptian culture arose, end quote. In contrast to most Egyptologists, even today, he saw any Near Eastern influence on Egypt's origins as ultimately superficial and adaptive, and I quote, we observe that Egypt, in a period of intensified creativity, became acquainted with the achievements of Mesopotamia, that it was stimulated, and that it adapted to its own rapid development such elements as seemed compatible with its efforts. It mostly transformed what it had borrowed, and after a time rejected even these modified derivations. The famous Narmer palette illustrates this principle. Most of its iconography is distinctively Egyptian. Narmer's pose of slaying an enemy endured for millennia, and the cattle imagery of the goddess Bat Hathor and King Esbul were also enduring Egyptian symbols, and again, affiliated with that African cattle pastoralism. The one Mesopotamian motif of a serpopod never became important in Egyptian iconography, perhaps borrowed from an object like the cylinder seal, another Near Eastern feature that was quickly adapted to an Egyptian context and eventually abandoned in favor of scarab and stamp seals. Instead, Frankfurt argued that Egypt shared a profound relationship with other East African cultures. In particular, Egyptian kingship and religion was fundamentally different from Near Eastern civilization and strongly connected with the Northeast African cattle complex that survived in modern Southern Nilotic groups like the Dinka, perhaps reflected in ritual practices like the cattle dance, an example of which we found on rock art in Sudanese Nubia. You have to look kind of closely, but at the top there are a group of people dancing, and then a kind of herd of cattle with spots and different colorings down below. And this pre-dynastic figuring is usually interpreted as a similar kind of dancing figure to the Dinka man you see here. Frankfurt's view of Egypt as fundamentally African was not an example of the kind of simplistic and ultimately suspect notion of survivals argued by early anthropologists like Seligman, although Frankfurt does talk about the Hamitic character of the cultures involved. Instead, like Budge, Frankfurt makes a detailed argument for ethnoarchaeology. Rather than looking to Near Eastern institutions and cultures to understand ancient Egypt, one should look to other African cultures that potentially share common roots in a regional cultural complex that included cattle pastoralism. An increasing pace of archaeological work in the Sahara, the Oases, and the Eastern Desert, and in Sudanese Nubia, lends support to Frankfurt's notion of Egypt's origins in a Northeast African context, but without his problematic reference to Hamites. During the Epipaleolithic and Neolithic, about 8,000 to 3,500 BCE, The stark contrast between the Sahara and the Nile did not exist, something that Egyptologists have still not largely fully taken into account. With some notable exceptions like Fakhri Hassan, who argues that the many features connected with cattle pastoralism in Egyptian religion and kingship ultimately came from the desert, especially imagery surrounding the cow goddess Bat and Hathor. Archaeological and paleoclimate research by scholars like Fred Wendorf and Romad Schild at Nabta Playa, which you can see here on the map, that has transformed our view of the Sahara during the pre-dynastic period. More recently, Africanist Rudolf Cooper from the University of Cologne led an extensive multidisciplinary project that has established the basis for the reconstruction of long-term climate change in the Sahara. Their research has demonstrated that summer rains extended north in Egypt from about 8,000 to 5,000 BC, creating an environment that you see here in these inset photographs. Although a desiccating trend began in the formative Badari and Nagata periods between about 5,000 and 3,500 BC, modern conditions weren't reached in Egypt until the end of the third millennium, 1,000 years after the formation of the Pharaonic state, and even later in Sudanese Nubia. The notion that Egyptian civilization developed in isolation along a thin strip of green that bordered the Nile, somehow divorced from the rest of Africa because barren deserts surrounded it, can no longer be sustained. David Wengrow and colleagues have recently embraced a nuanced view of an African origin for pharaonic civilization linked to the wet phase. Instead of development in isolation along the Nile with influence from Western Asia, they see Egyptian civilization as part of the primary pastoral community that emerged in Northeast Africa during the 5th millennium BC, or perhaps even earlier. They state, and I quote, "What came to be shared across this extensive region were the materials and practices, including perhaps especially modes of ritual practice, out of which more local contrasts and group identities were constructed." Their position resonates with Frankfurt's notion of an African substratum, while avoiding the pitfalls of older, more suspect models like survivals, diffusion, migration, contained in the Hamitic hypothesis. As they note, and I quote, "is by charting the spatial and temporal distribution of specific cultural practices that the beginnings of a distinctly African context for the later prehistory of the Nile Valley may yet come into focus," end quote. These cultural practices include both symbolic expression and distinctive material culture traditions with ties throughout the region. Our UCLA and UCSB surveys at the 3rd and 4th cataracts of the Nile have made a modest contribution to this picture. For example, this elephant on mountains motif found on rock art at the 3rd cataract is similar to one on the Coptos Colossi, which you can see to the right. In our case, the mountains are rectilinear rather than rounded, perhaps connected to markers along somewhat later Old Kingdom trade routes across the Sahara. A hippo hunt graffito shares a close parallel with pre-dynastic and later pharaonic symbolism that was connected to the king's ritual slaying of the forces of chaos in the form of an animal manifestation of the god Seth. Pottery recovered from our work at the 4th cataract on the left includes widely distributed types like calciform beakers and the very specific technique of ripple burnish, which you see here, which is widely distributed from Upper Egypt in the north, west to the Sahara, into Sudanese Nubia, and as far south as Khartoum. The final argument for Egypt's being in but not of Africa is its supposed limited influence and trade in other parts of Africa compared to the Near East and circum-Mediterranean world. This argument both underestimates Egypt's reach in Northeast Africa and overstates its influence in Western Asia. In fact, the extent of trade and diplomatic contacts are arguably more extensive to the Southwest than to the Northeast, as you can see here, tracing out various relationships. Only a handful of Egyptian or influenced objects have been found in the Aegean or wider Mediterranean, but matching those are similar luxury items found in Ethiopia and Sudan, south of Khartoum. We know mainly from text rather than objects that Egyptian state and diplomatic relations traded with far-off Babylon, but the same can be said for Punt, likely located either in modern Eritrea or Somalia at the Horn of Africa. Archeological and epigraphic evidence indicates that Egyptian expeditions reached a surprising distance from the Nile Valley. Expedition leaders traveled from Dakhla Oasis, past the Gulf Kabir to Uwainat, and on perhaps to Libya and Chad, or Darfur in Sudan. Normally thought of as a Nubian ally and trading partner, a graffiti mentioning yam recently discovered at Uwainat makes the Ineti Mountains in Chad its likely location. So if Egypt had a long relationship and considerable influence in the Levant, they had an even longer and more profound relationship to Nubia, including not only the trade in luxuries, but a deeply entangled history of commonalities from their Northeast African origins, robust interactions, and mutual influence stretching over millennia. For example, among other things, Nubian theology profoundly influenced the cult of Amun-Re, including its ram imagery. And you can see a Kushite example below and a New Kingdom Egyptian example from our excavation at Tombos to the right. However, Nubia has often been seen as a primitive culture, civilized by and lying in the shadow of Egypt. Egyptological narratives in the 20th century emphasized a portrayal of Nubia as a dominated periphery, dependent on Egypt for any degree of sophistication or civilization. And Kush inevitably declined in periods of time when that influence waned. In the early 20th century, James Breasted and George Andrew Reisner even argued that the Kushite pharaohs weren't even Kushite. In spite of this, his insistence on the Theban origins of the Kushite kings, Breasted expresses his contempt for the Kushite dynasty, saying, and I quote, "Assyria was never dealing with a first-class power in her conquest of Egypt when the unhappy Nile dwellers were a strong ruler, and for such a ruler they looked in vain during the supremacy of the inglorious Ethiopians," referring here to Nubia, not modern Ethiopia. Withdrawing to Napata, the Ethiopians gave their attention to the development of Nubia. As the Egyptians resident in the country died out and were not replaced by others, the Egyptian gloss with the people had received began rapidly to disappear, and the land relapsed into a semi-barbaric condition. These views echo Knott's earlier discussion of racial mixing in Egypt. According to Knott, having been founded by Caucasians, Egypt declined after mixing with inferior Black Africans. And I quote, wherever in the history of the world, the inferior racers have conquered and mixed with the Caucasians, the latter has sunk into barbarism. Robert Young observes that Knott has turned in this way, and I quote, his theory of Egyptian history into a general historical theory of the rise and fall of nations according to the principle of race. Yet for Nubiologists, this is the point where Kushite civilization becomes very interesting. The Kushites incorporated and adapted elements from both cultures and the Mediterranean world to create a vibrant new civilization that lasted 1,000 years after Tutamani, the last Nubian pharaoh, departed from Egypt in the mid-7th century BCE. John Wilson, writing in the 1950s, also reflects an attitude of Nubian inferiority when describing the Kushite dynasty. And I quote, "The story of Pianki's conquest of Egypt is an extraordinarily interesting human document, particularly in the contrast between this backwater Puritan and the effete and sophisticated Egyptians." He goes on to say, "Thus Egypt fell under the nominal rule of an Ethiopian from the despised provinces and under the effectual rule of a woman. The woman he refers to as the god's wife of Umun, Amenirtis, so he manages to be both racist and sexist at the same time." One of the things that sets Kushite civilization apart from Egypt is the role of powerful women leaders like Amanitore, you see on the right here, in the traditional role of slaying enemies opposite King Natakamani. This is clearly a negative for Wilson, but something that we celebrate today. These are the Kandakes, powerful queens who inspired the recent revolution in Sudan that deposed longtime dictator Omar al-Bashir. And here you see an iconic example of this, Allah Saleh, in April of 2019, exhorting to the crowd to not stand down. Wilson's characterization of conquest from the despised provinces mimics earlier Egyptian ideology that emphasized the inferiority and disorganization of the barbarians who surrounded the inner order. This is masterfully rendered in microcosm on Tutankhamun's painted box, with an Egyptian soldier confidently striding on the battlefield, surrounded by a chaotic array of dead and dying Nubians, imagery repeated for Asiatics on the other side. Wilson's notion of an Egyptian humiliations at the hands of implicitly Black Nubians is a theme that still has currency today, in particular in the documentary Rise of the Black Pharaohs and the National Geographic article that I discussed earlier, where Nubians are shown in the older ethnic stereotype from Tutankhamun's time. Note the musculature and stance of the Kushites here compared to the Egyptians, as well as their anachronistic costume, which frankly have racist undertones. Of course, the Kushite kings depicted themselves with their own take on pharaonic kingship. like this distinctively Kushite image of Tanutamani from his tomb at El Kuru. You can see in his crown, ornamentation, dress, and so on, they look superficially Egyptian, but in fact are very Kushite in the way they're presented. Shamarka has pointed out how the anachronistic emphasis on racial division inherent in the Black Pharaohs theme distorts ancient Kushite Egyptian relations by inappropriately mapping modern racial views onto an ancient social and political context. There's no indication that light or dark skin carried any connotation of superiority or inferiority in ancient Egypt. In particular, the color black had positive, not negative connotations associated with the rich soil of the floodplain, fertility, and rebirth through the Osiris myth, a god often represented with black skin. In the New Kingdom, important figures like Queen Ahmose Nefertari, a founding patroness of the 18th dynasty who was venerated for centuries, and the high military advisor Maherpri were both represented with black skin color, probably signaling Nubian ancestry. Maherpri also wears some Nubian jewelry. It's a little hard to see here, but if you look closely, you can see an ivory choker, bracelets, and armlets. And the vizier Aper-El from a few decades later retained his northern Canaanite name, and yet, like Maherpri, rose to high rank. Given the population dynamics of its position in Africa, Egypt likely always had a degree of phenotypic and cultural diversity. By the 8th century BCE, Nubians and Egyptians had been interacting and forging communities together for thousands of years and shared a deep history, as I mentioned before, of the Saharan Neolithic's primary pastoral community. It is thus, in fact, far more likely that Kashta and Pianki were welcomed by the Theban elites as a geopolitical counterweight to competing Libyan dynasts in the north and the looming threat of Assyria. Indeed, Thebans were remarkably loyal to the Kushite pharaohs, perhaps at least in part because of their shared devotion to Amun-Re and the importance of Napata as Amun's birthplace. But to return to Wilson's view of Nubian inferiority, which still has considerable currency today, to what extent was Nubia backwater to effete and sophisticated Egypt? Instead of continuing to focus on royalty, I will turn to select examples from the UCSB Purdue University expedition to Tombos in northern Sudan, which gives us a sense of the sophistication of broader Kushite culture that belies Wilson's characterization of the Kushites. Founded around 1450 BCE as an ancient Egyptian colony, settlers came to Tombos from Egypt and mixed with the local population. Our work is concentrated in the cemetery, which you see here, where we have uncovered a series of small pyramids of colonial administrators, as well as a range of more modest burials. One of the most remarkable things about the cemetery is that it continued to thrive after the end of the empire across the so-called Nubian Dark Age from 1070 to 747 BCE, right into the period of the 25th dynasty. This pattern is also emerging at other excavations and contradicts older models of decline and political fragmentation. Instead, what we see at Tombos and other sites is an increasing pattern of cultural entanglement, starting at the very beginnings and reflecting the profound and transformative impact of Kushites on colonial society and vice versa. These cultural entanglements become increasingly diverse and dynamic around 1200 BCE, with the construction of Nubian-style tumuli or burial mounds made of great blocks of granite, as you see here, in a separate area of the cemetery. And I'll talk in particular about two tombs to give some examples, one from the tumuli and then another, a new pyramid tomb built in the period of the 25th dynasty. As you can see here in a tumulus burial practice is increasingly mixed in both the newer and older areas. With Egyptian style extended, the norm, this burial was robbed in antiquity, but you can see what's left of the body is showing that it's on the back and straight in alignment in Egyptian tradition. But a small number of Nubian-style flex burials, interestingly, all of women, show the continuation of a long-standing Nubian tradition. One, as well as you can see here, the leg from a bed and trenches for a bed to be placed in this tomb, and the continuation of blacktop pottery, all Nubian traditions. One remarkable tomb contained a rich assortment of Nubian jewelry, including a green glazed quartz and red seashell ornaments in the middle, with high-quality Egyptian amulets. Two amulets of Isis, a Kushite favorite, and examples of dwarf gods Bes and an exceptional Patekos reflect a preference for particular deities. An unusually large scarab you can see below has a unique design and was surely a local product, reflecting a creative adaptation of Egyptian themes. The Pharohs is truly a masterpiece and has distinctive qualities and similarities to royal tombs from Khufu that point towards a local production and also the connections of the tomb owner. The so-called Nubian Dark Age was not so dark. It was instead characterized by cultural creativity, artisanal skill, and regional ties. A pyramid complex from the 25th dynasty of Thambos attests to the revival or perhaps continued construction of these monuments in a private context. And you see here, just reduced to foundations in archeology, but we can reconstruct about what it would have looked like in the upper right-hand corner. And most likely it was this local tradition of pyramid construction that influenced the construction of royal Kushite pyramids with their steep sides and fronted by a chapel like our monument at Thambos. The more modest vaulted chamber tomb discovered right next to it, you can just see it to the left here, provides a rich picture of life among the Kushite elite and their complex relationship between longstanding local and the latest cosmopolitan traditions. This underground chamber tomb, you can see it in the foreground here, was looted in antiquity, but fortunately for us, the vaulting collapsed and the tomb robbers, having ripped away the torso, perhaps to get after gold jewelry around the neck, apparently lost interest. We love lazy tomb robbers. Although the organic materials like wood and wrappings were poorly preserved, the body of a man was clearly wrapped in and mummified and placed in a coffin, but also placed on a bed. And you can see the outline here. And it took some tricky excavating, but you can tell all of the different layers and separate them apart and document them. A scarab named Pharaoh Shabaka, so pointing to a date around 700 BCE at the height of the Nubian dynasty, and a ceramic beaker decorated with a black-topped tradition going way back in the history of Nubian civilization, indicates these traditional elements remain. And yet he also was equipped with the latest weaponry, including this beautiful spear point from an iron. And this identifies our man as a soldier, or more likely an officer in the Kushite army, given his wealth. Like the tumulus burials, jewelry includes a combination of Egyptian amulets, but with black and white beads reflecting a Nubian sensibility. The choice of deities is selective and adaptive, including a lot of references to Amun-Re, an example of the dwarf god Pharohs, and the frog, cat, and scarab would also represent elements that the Nubians picked up on. The scarab with its cryptographic inscription is particularly interesting and unique, with only one other like it also found in Nubia. A remarkable series of copper alloy bowls and an extraordinary painted wooden cosmetic box reflect the tomb owner's sophistication and also signal a cosmopolitan worldview. And these are really hard to photograph and see, but you can see the outline of a kind of charging bull and several of them, 5 of them in a circle around the edge of this bowl. They also reflect a bull and cow theme that resonates with the long history of emphasis on cattle imagery in Kushite society, going back to that Neolithic complex. 2 bowls were chased with images of charging bulls. You see one of them here, a motif found on a faience bowl from the tomb of one of Pianki's wives, today in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, but also reflects ties to bowls from the Iron Age International style in a variety of media, including ivory objects from Nimrud and metal bowls generally attributed to Phoenician artists. Another bowl with a cow wearing a lotus is likely associated with the goddess Hathor, but again ties the owners to a set of preferences for cattle imagery as well as that international style. A decorated cosmetic box in a very fragile condition, but quite impressive, provides a unique and particularly dramatic example of internationalism in motifs that reflect a continuing preoccupation with cattle on each side. And here again, it's a little hard to see because of the delicate nature of the box, and conservators continue to work on this, but I'll give you a little help. You can see a cow here licking a calf with a papyrus swamp in the background with alternating open and closed papyrus blossoms. Imagery of the cow suckling the calf in a papyrus swamp is again tied to Hathor, but with the addition of a heron to its right, and I'll help you out again here, resonating with the Bennu bird of the Egyptian creation myth, along with a swampy background. This motif was especially popular in the international style. Here you see an ivory from Nimrud, with numerous parallels in the contemporary Nimrud ivories as well as metal bowls. And the addition of the heron, however, is novel. Another side shows an infant god emerging from a lotus blossom, a reference to the infant Horus emerging from the lotus flower, which arose from the primeval waters and birthed the sun. The specific configuration here with the infant god flanked by a calf and a cow, and kind of reaching out his hand to pat the calf on the head, is absolutely unique. I've never seen anything like it. And here, just a little bit of help. This is a image taken with special lighting. The bright white indicates the use of Egyptian blue, a very costly and sophisticated pigment that was quite common in these kind of contexts. You can see the cow and the calf a little bit better here. The unique combination of motifs represents a cattle theme, what I would like to think of as an explosion of creativity and innovation, combining themes connected to Hathor and fertility, the creation myth, the myth of Isis and Horus, at the same time placed in dialogue with that broader Iron Age internationalism, but not imitating it. The box's contents were equally remarkable. In addition to a set of iron tweezers, and here's another example from the international style, particularly the figure on the right, but again, without the cows. Instead, you have two deities flanking Horus the Younger as he emerges from the lotus blossom. So here are the contents. So in addition to a set of iron tweezers, which you see on the right, bronze razors, iron implements, small cosmetic bottles, and a copper needle came out of the box, and also a group of extraordinary faience cosmetic vessels of the highest quality that would have held perfume or fine oils. So although our soldier, we know from the bones, was, let's say, ripped, he was a strong, big, muscular guy, he also, when he stepped out, he wanted to look good. And so everything was plucked, shaved, and he was scented and oiled up to look like a magnificent warrior, I guess you'd say. So the first vessel is on the right is simple, imitating an Egyptian alabastron, but in blue faience instead of stone. Another vessel has a skillfully rendered diamond-shaped design, imitating a beaded net and cords for hanging. This motif is unique and aligns with the traditional Nubian practice of hanging pots and nets, but masterfully rendered in faience. This is really as good as it gets. Finally, a remarkable jar with 4 figures of the god Bes, who became popular in Sudanese Nubia, is truly a masterpiece. And I include an example from a royal tomb at El Kuru of a Bes figurine for comparison. The frog on the lotus lid is also remarkable in craftsmanship and detail. And of course, as well as preservation, we were very lucky that these were in such good condition. A parallel was found far away on Sardinia, but a very similar lid with just the lotus was found not so far away at Sanam near Napata. The jars could have been imported from Egypt or even the Levant, but Sudanese Nubia has a long history of faience production, so I would argue that they were more likely produced locally. In any case, they are unique masterworks. Nothing like them has been found either in Sudan or Egypt, and the discovery reinforces the importance of Sudanese Nubia as a cultural and political power during the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. It is clear from recent excavations at Tombos and elsewhere that Nubia was not an unsophisticated backwater during and even before the Kushite dynasty. An object like our frog lid might travel to distant locations. The copper bowls, wooden box with their cattle motifs and cryptographic scarab with its elaborated formula demonstrate creative ties to the international style and asserted a cosmopolitan social status that connected the tomb owner to an elite culture that spanned Nubia, Egypt, and extended to Mesopotamia and across the Mediterranean during the Iron Age. The popularity of red seashell ornaments show that they also maintained ties within Africa. There was no reason to see Nubians as passive consumers of this cosmopolitan material culture, and every reason to think that they were active participants in the diverse expressions of the Iron Age international style, creating objects like our faience vessels and the bowl and amulets from Kuru and elsewhere, and certainly being selective in their choice of motifs and materials, whether acquired through trade, specially commissioned, or made locally. So if I have argued here that both ancient Egypt and Nubia are best seen as African civilizations, then can we also see both as Black African civilizations? The first thing to recognize is that while the notion of biological human races is a powerful and a very real phenomenon, it is a modern cultural construct, mutable and socially contingent, not a scientific reality. Racial characteristics like skin color do not correlate with bounded groups, but instead are distributed in clines, continuous and overlapping variations based on a combination of evolutionary adaptation, interbreeding, and genetic drift. Egypt's response to the question of race and more broadly Afrocentrism has often been to deny the relevance of race in discussions of Egypt, noting correctly that modern concepts of biological race, like those advanced by Glidden, were alien to the ancient Egyptians themselves. Yet the rhetoric of Kushite Black Pharaohs suggests a different dynamic. As Anne Macy Roth, and a tip of the hat to her for trying to raise these issues very early on, noted some time ago, and I quote, "At this juncture, however, many Egyptologists miss the point. Why not use Nubia, I have been asked, or any of the other great African civilizations? Why can't they leave Egypt alone?" This attitude is not a new one, going back to the 19th and early 20th centuries when Egyptologists like Petrie and Breasted were in dialogue with African-American scholars like W.D. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, something that's the subject of some fascinating research by Vanessa Davies, and I'm looking really forward to seeing what she comes up with. This emphasis of Nubia Kush as a kind of acceptably Black version of implicitly white Egypt unconsciously draws upon racist ideas that sought to diminish Blackness and justify slavery and later segregation in the United States. As an important figure in the foundation of American Egyptology, George Glidden explicitly connected notions of racial hierarchy to skin color in his 1843 book, Ancient Egypt, and here I've got Types of Mankind as well, rejecting the notion that, and I quote, "We who trace back to Egypt the origin of every art and science known in antiquity have to thank the sable Negro or the dusky Berber for the first gleams of knowledge and invention." So he's very explicitly tying skin color to superiority and inferiority. In 1844, Samuel Morton concluded based on his skull measurements that, and I quote, "Negroes were numerous in Egypt, but their social position as it is now, that of servants and slaves." Typically glossed over or simply ignored in Egyptological treatments of Glidden, these arguments about race in ancient Egypt played a central role in justifying American slavery in the run-up to the Civil War, both as a means of naturalizing the role of enslaver and enslaved through an appeal to a racialized construction of ancient Egyptian society, and as a rationalization for miscegenation laws with Knott's ideas about the degradation of racial blending. Robert Young persuasively concludes that, and I quote, "Improbably, therefore, biology and Egyptology together constituted the basis of the new, quote, scientific racial theory." These early views continue to influence popular culture and seemingly objective scholarship within both the US and Europe. For example, film directors and producers typically cast white actors of European ancestry to play ancient Egyptian historical figures and deities. Ridley Scott's recent film, Exodus, Gods and Kings, went farther, casting white actors for roles depicting the Egyptian elite, while actors of color were relegated to the underclass. The English director was unapologetic when confronted with the racist implications of this decision, arguing that box office draw drove his decision-making. However, many found this defense unpersuasive. In particular, Scott Mendelsohn pointed out forcefully in Forbes that the notion that he had to cast white actors for box office draw was overstated, noting there were suitable actors of color with greater recognizability who could have been cast. Scott's racialized depiction of ancient Egyptians with its white overclass and black underclass resonates all too well with Morton, Knott, and Glidden's idea of a superior white master race ruling over an inferior black African underclass. Petrie, Dawson, and Emring's ideas of a dynastic master race surely also draws from this early rhetoric, which remains embedded in Western views of ancient Egypt. This bias was illustrated in a modern scientific context by a recent DNA study in Nature Communications that received a great deal of press, unfortunately. They concluded that the foundational population of ancient Egypt was related not to other Africans, but rather to Middle Eastern peoples, contradicting modern genetic studies of contemporary Egyptians. They go on to posit that modern genetic ties between Egyptians and other Africans came with the medieval Arab slave trade. Nature's own publicity for this piece reflects how deeply embedded this assumption is, even in the academy, and here it is here. And you know, here we have someone saying how nice it is that this study now provided empirical evidence for this assumption at the genetic level, without even realizing that this completely begs the question. The study was fundamentally flawed. The authors overgeneralized all of Egyptian history from a sample of only 90 individuals from a single poorly documented cemetery in northern Egypt, only 3 with a full genome. The burials date to the latest periods of Egyptian history, so how you extrapolate then back to the very dawn of Egyptian civilization is puzzling at best. And all but three or four individuals came from after 1000 BCE. They did not include any individuals from southern Egypt or Nubia, something they admit as a weakness only at the very end of the article. They also conflate sub-Saharan Africa and Africa, as well as assuming a haplotype that is normally regarded as African is really Middle Eastern. Haplotypes are groups of genes that tend to be inherited from parent to children and indicate population affinities. This was called out in peer review comments, but never adequately addressed by the authors. Additionally, they are oblivious to the fact that the mouth of the Fayum oasis, where the sample was located, is well known through historical documents as an area where Middle Eastern people, like the Sheridan, were settled as a reward for military service during the late New Kingdom from about 1300 to 1070 BCE. This provides a far more likely explanation for any stronger affinity to Middle Eastern populations and weaker ties to sub-Saharan populations than modern Egyptians in their sample, but was not even considered. Even worse, they were completely oblivious to the long history of racism centered around the question, like Petrie's dynastic race and the Hamitic hypothesis. So to conclude, the question of race in ancient Egypt is of great importance in modern society because of Egyptology's central and profoundly disturbing role in the creation of a theory of scientific racism that justified the worst kinds of discrimination, especially in America. Egyptologists might object that many Egyptians, like you see on the left here, Nubians on the right, would disagree with this conclusion, and that's correct. But my point is about American and European constructions of race. By modern American systems of racial classification, the ancient and modern Egyptians would both fall into the category of Black African. As Ann Roth, following Bruce Williams, pointed out years ago, an ancient Egyptian transported to the American South in the days of segregation would not be allowed to sit at a Woolworths bar, would have to go to the back of the bus, would be barred from facilities reserved for whites. The same applies to most of the modern Egyptians and Nubians I know and have worked with. Even though they might not self-identify that way, all the evidence points to a broad continuity of both groups as Northeast African populations. And in the end, I'm the only person in these two photographs who would be welcome at a lunch counter at Woolworths or would be allowed to sit in the front of the bus and not have to surrender my seat to a white person. The power of acknowledging both Nubia and Egypt as African civilizations is that it destroys the logic of racism, especially American racism with its strongly polarizing view of blackness and whiteness drawn from slavery. Young observes perceptively that, and I quote, Egypt as the earliest civilization developed in Africa clearly represented the major potential stumbling block for the permanent inferiority of the Black race, which it was alleged had never created or produced anything of value. Similarly, Trafton points out that this debate lies at the heart of the often polarizing back and forth between mainstream and Afrocentric Egyptology. A hierarchy of race like that developed by Morton, Knott, and Glidden, and still deployed today by white supremacists, cannot be sustained if not one but two great Black civilizations arose in Africa at the dawn of history. It is therefore entirely appropriate and even necessary to confront constructions of race for Nubia and Egypt in the recent past and acknowledge both civilizations as African and Black, dispelling the myth of racial classification and ranking that have their genesis with Glidden and the beginnings of American Egyptology. Thank you.
Great. Fabulous, Stuart. That was a fabulous lecture. I don't know if people can't unmute and clap, but that was marvelous. And
Yeah.
I think Abby's going to curate the questions, and we're of course Peter gave that marvelous introduction, and we're going to let him start. But I do have two things to ask. First, one is a sort of a funny quiz, but I want to ask that second. First is that, but the Egyptians and Nubians distinguished between themselves in terms of color. The Nubians were always, as you pointed out, painted with darker skin, right? So to quote Cornel West and apply it anachronistically, color mattered in their representations of each other, right? So the Egyptians were represented as, ruddy or lighter, and the Nubians represented as, black or black, jet black. How do you explain that in the context of your marvelous presentation and your conclusions? If they were, but essentially what you were arguing is that you were asking, are we projecting backwards racial difference? But it's there in the visual evidence. So how do we explain it forward?
Yeah, so I've discussed this quite a lot. One of my interests is looking at ethnic identity in ancient Egypt. And I think you can make a distinction between race and ethnicity. So race is constructed, as I talked about, as a kind of biological reality, even though we know it's a social construction, but it's based on the idea of speciation. So the idea that they're separate, in the case of Knox, Glidden, and Morton, they were arguing for separate, completely separate species.
They were total
often you see the argument for subspecies.
Yeah, they were total race.
It's just horrible reading their stuff.
Right.
But ethnicity is similar in the sense that it plays off of primordial attachments. So the idea of ancestry, but it doesn't have that sense of biological sort of essentializing idea of biology involved. So what the Egyptians were doing with their different coloration, simply recognizing that clinal distribution that I was talking about. So as you go from the equator north, people's skin color tends to get a bit lighter, and that's simply an evolutionary adaptation to the absorption of vitamin D. So for example, my ancestors in England and Ireland had real problems, and so light skin was an advantage. When I go to Egypt and Sudan, light skin is a real disadvantage for me in that area. But also people intermix and intermarry, so it gets kind of things get diverse very quickly in those kind of contexts. However, you can see that overall pattern. So you go to Egypt today, you look in the north, people tend to be a bit lighter, people move around though, so it's not inevitable. In the south, they're a bit darker, in Nubia, darker still, and so on. I think that's what the Egyptians were recognizing when they created these ethnic stereotypes. But as I noted before, for one thing, dark and light wasn't better or worse. So the Asiatics, who were lighter to the north of Egypt, are represented that way in this ideological stereotype, were treated exactly as contemptuously as the Nubians. This is a mistake that some Egyptologists have made, is arguing that Nubians were, like Wilson and his despised Nubians. Well, the folks from the north were equally despised.
Sure.
But also, you have to realize this is, sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. I interrupted.
Yeah, so you have to realize, so this plays out in specific social contexts too. So in a royal context where the king is legitimating his power over the people who surround Egypt, you see this kind of polarizing ethnic stereotype being created. And there they're going for difference. So they're taking the extremes. So they take, the lightest people from the north, the darkest people from the south, and that's how they represent those other peoples, with Egypt in the middle. But when you look at other representations of both Egyptians and Nubians, you actually see overlap. So sometimes both Egyptians and Nubians are represented with brown skin rather than red skin. Sometimes Nubians, like Tenochtitlan in that picture I showed in his tomb, are represented with red skin. Again, signaling these kind of relationships, role as an Egyptian king. And so the color was applied in a very idealizing way, and recognized that clinal distribution. But the reality of Egypt would be you would have seen people of a variety of complexions, people with ancestry more from the north, or perhaps from groups like the Sheridan who came and settled in Egypt would be lighter. Nubian, people related to Nubians like Maherpuri who came in with darker. So you would have seen, kind of a real range of coloration. When you start looking at more prosaic paintings of Egyptians from tombs, for example, you often see that overlap and variation occurring. I think when we try and make that race, then that's what we're mapping on prejudice. It's when we start mapping on these kind of modern ideas.
Oh, no.
In a context where
I accept the distinctions you're making between ethnicity and race, and it's no argument there. But what intrigues me is that both Egyptians and Nubians were concerned often to represent their color. Charles Bonnet's, a difference of color, and the blackness of skin with the Nubians. The Egyptians did many times, and God knows the Nubians did. When Charles Bonnet found the black pharaohs, you can't get blacker than that, right? So we don't have, there's no clear statement anybody wrote a discourse on color in ancient Egypt or in Nubia. We're extrapolating. But I keep coming back to this fact that it was important enough when the Nubians painted the pharaohs between 1744 and 656 BC, right? The 25th dynasty, which Charles, and his colleagues uncovered, they made themselves black. And why would they do that themselves? You see what I mean? When you talk about the gradation of color from light to, reddish brown to black among the Egyptians, that doesn't explain why the Nubian pharaohs would have themselves represented that way. And I would love your theory about that. And maybe you mentioned it and I missed it.
Yeah, no, I didn't really address it particularly, but again, it goes back to the dynamics of ethnic identity. And because they did refer to themselves as Kushites, right? So not as Egyptians.
Right.
And so I think that's part of that, creating that contrast. But the thing about ethnicity too is that it's mutable and it's socially contingent, which means it plays out in different social contexts in different ways. And so we have Tutankhamun in his tomb representing himself as looking pretty Egyptian. But yet, like you say, we have other examples where Kushite kings are represented in a more Kushite format, looking darker with a physiognomy that we usually associate with peoples from farther south. And that also plays out at Thebes during the period of the Dynasty, when these Nubian kings are represented in tombs. You have these kind of dual modes of representation, sometimes in a more Egyptian mode with these kind of Egyptian features, sometimes in a more Nubian mode. And we see that also earlier, where people, depending on, again, whether a Nubian prince, for example, is participating in a grand ideological ceremony as the tamed enemy of Egypt's, paying homage to the king, he has to look Nubian. But in his own tomb, he represents himself as Egyptian. And so, so that's why the color wasn't to be absolute, but it was dependent on the context, and it's a kind of symbolic signaling, not in the sense of not that sense of absolute color. And again, there were differences for sure. Yeah. And again, there would have been this variability as you go south, people get darker. And that's kind of what they're recognizing. But they emphasize that when they want to make a point about difference.
Right. Well, it's. I think that we should still want to be fascinated by and encourage our students and each other to be fascinated about differences of representational color and throw the biological construction of race in the garbage can of history. We could do that, and we've all agreed on that, but that still leaves representation, and it's a valid and intriguing line of inquiry. But I'm going to open this up, but I promise you a quiz. Okay, this is the quiz. Why are traditionally, now they're integrated, but why were Black Episcopal churches named St. Philip's Church overwhelmingly throughout the United States? All Black Episcopal churches, meaning with a black priest and a black congregation were often called St. Philip's. Why? And this is related to something you said in your lecture.
I'm afraid actually, I don't know that offhand, although I am an Episcopalian, so I ought to, I guess.
It was because of Acts 8 with the Ethiopian eunuch, which had been sent by the Kandake. And I say Kandake, is that the correct pronunciation? How do you pronounce the name of the Nubian queen?
Yeah, more or less.
The Meroitic queen? Huh?
Yeah, Kandake is usually how I... Kandake is usually how I pronounce it.
For those of you who don't know, Philip the Evangelist is walking down the street and he sees a black man who turns out to be a eunuch who had been sent to Jerusalem by the Kandake, right? And that is why, one way we knew that there were black queens called the Kandakes, as you mentioned, and they were very active in recent politics, and they've been queens forever. And that is accounted for in Acts 8. So there was nobody, they couldn't call their churches the Ethiopian eunuch church, so they called him St. Philip's, because it's he who interacts with the treasurer, I think, from the Kandake, which I find quite fascinating. And color comes into it there because Ethiopian meant burnt face. And it's in Greek anyway, so, yeah. But they were talking about Nubian or Meroitic, right? Culture, I believe. Mm-hmm. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, now you know, and that shows the continuity of the dynasties and up till today. Anyway, let's open this up. Peter, did you have a question? If not, Abby, do you want to curate the questions? Marvelous lecture, my friend. Really marvelous. This is going to be a great book, Stuart.
Thanks very much.
Okay, Abby. Okay, I think if Peter has a question, we'll get to Peter's question, but thank you so much for this lecture. This is not my field, but it was fascinating anyway, and I love learning more about it and in more detail. We have a lot of questions and we are not going to get all through all of them. I've tried to group them as much as I could to represent as much as possible what people are interested in. So I'm going to start with a kind of teacherly question. A couple of people have asked you for your list of sources or for some references you can make, and one in particular, Elaine Sullivan and others are asking you to recommend books or articles that talk about race in ancient Egypt and Nubia and the issues in historiography that you brought up today that could be used in undergraduate courses. She says it's very hard to find basic introductory materials of this nature.
Yeah, so I have to think about that a little, but in book form, Egyptland is probably the best treatment of 19th century racism, and this group of, Samuel Morton, Knott, and Glidden, and really how deeply involved they were in the formation of American racism, the justification for slavery, but also how African Americans were very much engaged and pushing back against those arguments. So it's really a fascinating study, but it is book length. There is the article I cited, and I'd have to look up the exact reference, by Young, who I think makes the best statement. And in fact, when I was reading, I went, yes, this is exactly what I've been thinking, but haven't articulated, about the connection between these early scholars and the importance and centrality of Egypt in the rationale for American racism in particular. And you can really see it in the rhetoric, and it gets repeated by folks like Petrie and European scholars as well. But especially in America, where you had to have that kind of division between superior white and inferior black people, Egypt provided both a correlate for that in the way they framed it, but also, as he mentioned, if Egypt was a Black African civilization, then it destroys the argument completely. It's really fascinating to see it, and that's a nice article that one could assign. What else? I'd have to think a little bit more about that. I've written a lot about ethnicity. The most recent one in pieces from the Journal of Egyptian History that kind of represents my current thinking on it. I engage a little bit with the question of race as well. And then there's Anne Macy Roth that I quoted a couple of times, her letter from 1995 it's a kind of informal letter to colleagues where she talks about Afrocentrism and how ultimately advocates for the discipline engaging more with African-American scholars, with Africana studies and so on.
Wonderful. So
I can't think of anything else on that.
Okay, well,
contact me, I can.
Yeah, that gives us some follow-up reading material. I think Peter Dermanuelian is back with a question, so I'll mute myself just to limit the sound from here.
Thanks. Sorry, my connection winked out for a minute there, so I apologize if I'm repeating things that were already discussed, but fantastic lecture, Stuart, really well done. I think there's no argument that structural racism is built into early Egyptology, certainly in the first half of the 20th century when all the great excavations were going on. Would you agree that in recent decades, though, most Egyptologists have finally started to view Nubia through a Nubian lens and rather than sort of ducking down through the Egyptian lens? And do we have much, much further to go? Or do you say that the field has made some tremendous strides in the last 20 years or so?
Yeah, so I'll give you a two-part answer to that question, but I agree with you. I think the curve is bending, and especially over the past 10 years within Egyptology, I've seen a notable difference and a much stronger interest in Nubia, and also in Nubia as a civilization in its own right, interacting with Egypt, but something to be treated, as an important, kind of rival and partner. Before that, it was really the emergence of Nubian studies in the 1970s. And the late Laszlo Turek, who I dedicated my talk to, played a central role in trying to change that narrative. So Nubiology, it formed as a discipline mainly to counteract that Egyptological bias of seeing Nubia as just, an appendage in the shadow of Egypt. And then gradually over a period of time, and of course, work of Charles Bonnet at Kerma, counteracting Reisner's racist idea that Kerma was an Egyptian colony that declined, and in fact, it's a great African civilization that rose. That was and again, that's all in the 1970s when we start seeing the archeological evidence coming along. Over the past decade, what we've seen is a return to questions dealing with the transition from the New Kingdom Empire and the nature of the empire itself to the Kushite dynasty. And so the old model, which is still kind of around and lingering, of a Kushite or Nubian collapse after the Egyptians withdrew, I hate that term, from their colonial holdings in Sudan. These were people who had lived, in the case of Tombos, we have evidence for Egyptian settlers coming as early as the very beginning of founding of the colony in 1450. So in 1070, they just pick up and leave. That makes no sense at all. And they've intermixed with the local population. They have all sorts of local ties, personal and economic and so on. And that's what we're finding as in my case, a new excavation at Tombos, but Yale Spencer's re-excavation at Amara West especially has shown that there is strong evidence that these communities just kept continuing. And the same thing for communities farther south as well. They didn't even have that imprint of colonization. So this idea of Nubia falling apart into a group of competing chiefdoms, which itself is suspect, right? It again fits this model of once the Egyptians pull away, then Nubia falls into fragmentation and then gets its act together again once Egypt re-engages. And I think,
anything that
we
was
still have
great
a little
about
bit
Nubia,
of work to do.
Yeah. Anything great about the Nubians in the first place
Yeah,
had to have
exactly.
come from Libya. This is the amazing interpretation that always floors me. But I don't want to take
Yeah,
up
me
more
too.
time
It's like,
because I see
wait
there
a
are some
second.
wonderful Q&A questions here that we have. Abby, do you want to run the show there and follow on with some of these questions from our
Yeah.
audience?
Thank you. So as I said, I'm trying to group the questions because we have so many and we can't get to them all. Quite a lot of people are responding to you're introducing ideas of how this ties into the anti-Blackness or anti-racist work that we all have to do, and also thinking about anti-Blackness, anti-Black racism quite a bit. One question that I thought was particularly interesting and also addresses there's a lot of questions about contemporary Sudan as well. And this question kind of ties all of those together. It comes from Selma El-Kazin, who says she worked with Charles Bonnet in Kerma last December. She says, I'm 100% Sudanese and was born and raised in Canada. Charles, as well as all of the Egyptologists working at the site, are very adamant about the promotion of Sudanese history, as we know, especially to encourage a sense of identity among the people. She says throughout her apprenticeship with Professor Bonnet, her skin grew darker as she worked in the sun more. And a lot of women in Kerma would tell her that she needed to cover her skin so she didn't get too dark. She initially thought that this was due to media representations of Blackness and of dark skin that were contemporary, but her understanding is that this goes far beyond beauty standards today and is actually rooted in the history of Sudan and ancient Nubia. So if you could address that, but also she's asking for kind of a contemporary thought. How do you propose that this ideal can be changed in Sudan for the young women growing up who are pressured to bleach their skins and to think of lightness as a value?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's a really tricky issue that, again, with the Black Lives Matter movement and as it spread worldwide, I think it's getting more and more scrutiny. As I alluded to in the beginning of the talk, this is a question that's emerging now within the kind of broader Middle East and Northeast Africa, but also in Sudan, and especially the use of these lightening creams, and I've noticed it myself. And I would say it's less connected with the deep past, where again, as I pointed out, blackness and darkness was not a negative thing. Even when it's used in that kind of ethnic stereotype, it's more just a reflection of what people were observing and the creation of difference. But there was no idea of black being bad. But in modern society, and I think it goes back to modern colonialism, and may in part go back to the Arab slave trade as well, which had a huge impact on that part of Africa. And again, this ideal of lightness versus darkness. And again, I've seen some fascinating blog posts by people commenting on this. And Sudan is an incredibly complex country as well in terms of racial identity, but also tribal affiliations. It's often presented as African versus Arab, but those are social constructs as well. And then you see a huge, huge variation in groups. Tribal affiliation is often more important, but color prejudice definitely is involved. And the same thing within Egypt too. You look at how Nubians are treated in Egypt oftentimes, and Sudanese who go to Egypt, and I heard stories that are just horrible. And so those, these kind of things exist in these countries, and there's definitely that sense of color prejudice that goes along with it. So, I mean, I guess the best we can do is try and emphasize how, again, wonderful Kushite civilization is, and that blackness, darkness shouldn't be considered as a negative marker. That in fact it's, black is beautiful, what can I say? That kind of thing. And really trying to, a lot of this is driven by, the people who produce these cosmetics, who are selling them and playing into this kind of color bias. And that's something, again, this has come up in discussions. This is something that now those companies are starting to pull back on that marketing and so forth. But one thing about Nubians too is I had to trim it because I wanted to keep my lecture down to a reasonable amount of time. But there's strong evidence for cultural continuity between modern Nubians, like the folks at Tombos, who we work with, and ancient Nubians. You can see that in cultural practices, like they carry the dead still out to the cemetery on beds. You know, they don't bury the beds anymore, but you can see the continuity there. When they make a grave mound, they put pebbles, quartz pebbles on top of it, like they did in the Kermit civilization. And you can find all sorts of other things, like the horn deformation, shaping the horns, like in that picture with the Dinka, and so forth. So you can see, you know, strong continuities between the Nubia, you know, modern Nubians and ancient Nubians. And again, that's something that we can celebrate. And more broadly, you know, with Sudan, obviously parts of ancient Nubia are now, you know, aren't occupied by people who ethnically identify as Nubians, but surely their ancestors are related to the people who lived there at that, you know, period of time of the kingdom of Kush, ancient kingdom of Kush. And so it can definitely provide, you know, source of celebration. And it played a huge role in the revolution, which was really cool to see. Also that idea of women being empowered, and that's something, you know, living in Sudan, I've seen personally as well.
Yeah, there were quite a few questions about women and their representation, and also about the kind of ethnic bridging that you're talking about, and the ethnic, you know, kind of migration of peoples. Right now, I'm going to turn to a question from Suzanne Blier, who's a professor of art history here at Harvard, who we all know and love and respect. She calls it a transformative lecture and thanks you for it. She has one comment and one question. I'll read the comment quickly and then read a shorter version of the question if I can. We know that some of the most important pottery innovations, Karma, black on red, are found earliest in the southern area and then seem to move north. And she says this likely supports your thesis. So good, you know, good on that. Her question, and it has a word in it that I wrote phonetically so I can hopefully not mistake it. I have been interested in issues of autochthonies or autochthony in Egypt. Forgive my mispronunciation, notably in the integration of themes of Nubian wrestlers and plausibly ritual contexts, and the similarities between harp forms and music in New Kingdom Egypt and Central African forms. This would be before or outside kettle imagery and pastoralism. Do you think there is also an importance of continuing to celebrate earlier African cultures within the broader area? A related point, is there any relationship between Bes linked to childbirth, healing, transformation, a family god, with autochthony, again, possibly Mbuti and other pygmies who likely would have been in the mix before the desiccation of the Nile Valley? So question about earlier cultures as well.
Yeah, so that's a good point. And I think it goes back to, especially the way David Wengro and colleagues have framed this idea of a primary pastoral community. And it also goes back to Frankfurt's idea, but strips away some of the lingering framing, like the Hamitic nature of these peoples and so on, and gets it back to this group of people who are interacting and have these shared practices and so on. And this is another thing that sets apart both Egypt and Nubia from the Middle East. And we can see not just the cattle stuff, but other practices that I think are related. The harps, and it's hard sometimes to draw a line, a direct line. And part of that problem is the lack of archeological research in Sudan, in Darfur, in the South, and so on, even in Ethiopia, before Aksum, which was a huge, cultural achievement and another African state that should be recognized as well. But there's not a lot known about what was going on in Ethiopia before that time. Same thing with the Horn of Africa. It would be great to know what Puntite civilization was like. But all these areas have been bound up in civil war. I mean, in Ethiopia in Eritrea fighting, in Sudan, all sorts of insurgencies and civil war, north and south, east and west. Chad as well, having problems. It'd be great to know what was going on in Chad. So we have, what we end up with is a gap, and we can note some similarities though with these nilotic groups and with Egypt and Kerma. And one of those things would be the harps, which is very interesting. It would be really good to have, more of a direct connection, but the similarities are quite striking, and they're very distinctive too. So people come up, people are creative. They often come up with the same idea in different places. But when it's so similar, it really makes you wonder. Another feature that has always struck me is the use of headrests. So we see this in Egypt, we see this in Sudan. In fact, we're excavating in a Kerma cemetery that existed before the Egyptians colonized our area, and we found a headrest in one of those tombs as well. And we see this in a widespread way in East African cultures. So we see them using headrests, often probably to protect elaborate hairstyles. So you don't get, you spend all this time getting your hair just right, and then suddenly it's, you're smushed. One Egyptologist actually tried one and said it was comfortable when it was hot too, because it raised your head up above the ground and got airflow going through. So I think you can take a number of these different features, not just the cattle symbolism, but other cultural practices. And this is again what Frankfurt was talking about, that you have, and ultimately I think what Wengrow and colleagues are talking about as well, is that you have these features. Now, that doesn't mean you don't have differences. So Nubian and Egyptian civilizations are distinct in their own ways, but they have all these ties, overlaps, and of course this, back and forth, and with Egypt contributing things to Nubia, Nubia to Egypt, and so on over that long history. But you would see that throughout, so variations on a theme, if you will, throughout the region.
Thank you. Professor Gates, did you have another question?
Oh, no. I'm just wanted people to know I was here, just like if I were sitting in the front of the Thompson room.
Okay, good. So just
no,
one.
next question. How many questions do we have left, dear Abby?
Well, I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, well, we started a little bit late, so if you want to do two,
okay,
you can. Stuart's out there in California, man. He's going to have some Napa Valley wine or something. We got time. And it was so fascinating. Yeah, and that question about skin lightening, this is not only a Sudanese problem. That we used to see these horrible ads in the United States going back to newspapers in the 1920s, if not before. And then after Black is Beautiful in the 60s, my generation thought, well, that madness is over, but it's not over at all. And it's, it was always around in West Africa, and now it's, stronger even. And a place like Nubia, where, people were mid-range skin color. It's just sickening. It's absolutely sickening. And you could see the deleterious consequences of racialized theory that you so astutely critiqued from the 19th century, and actually it preceded that. But go ahead, Abby, ask him, make Stuart work for his, the less money that we're paying him for only giving him one lecture.
So here's an interesting question. Again, a lot, there were kind of broad questions and general questions, but here's a pretty specific one that I think strikes me as interesting. Comes from Allison Hedges, who asks, in your research and archaeological work, have you come across evidence of performance traditions or dramatic texts from Kush or Nubia that might coincide with or relate to those of Egypt?
That's an interesting question. Unfortunately, we don't have as many texts from Nubia as we do from Egypt for two reasons. One, during the whole period before the New Kingdom, if the Nubians were writing things down, it didn't survive. After that, we do see a kind of typical Egyptian texts, but with, again, kind of a Nubian twist when you look at temple layout and things like that. So you can get a sense of temple ritual. And there are some differences, but also they're taking, it's kind of Egyptian ceremonies, Egyptian temple layout and so forth, and building new temples or expanding old ones, restoring old ones. I like to think of it, they're kind of riffing off of Egyptian religious practices. So they're starting to do new things that, if you just look at it, you go, well, that looks Egyptian, but you realize, no, this is something completely new and innovative, which is really cool. In terms of dramatic texts, though, we have a couple of those from Egypt, especially centered around the myth of Horus and Seth, the classic, it's called The Triumph of Horus from Edfu Temple, which was actually translated by an Egyptologist as a play and performed several times. And when I teach Egyptian religion, I use it in my course. I have the students perform this kind of ritual play. It's not certain if that existed in Nubia. We're also hampered, though, by the fact that the Nubian language, Meroitic, is still not completely deciphered. An Egyptologist from the Sorbonne named Claude Rilly has made amazing strides recently, but we're still quite far from a decipherment. So one could hope that we might have more texts that might, in fact, include, sort of more of these religious rituals and performance. But you can bet there was there were certainly musical performances, ritual performances that went along with temple rituals. You can see that with the layout of temples. There were festivals for sure, and that there was a strong Nubian presence at the Temple of Isis in Philae as well. They kind of shared that cult, and in the end, were really running it after the Romans shut down other temples in Egypt. So.
Stuart, there is something else I'd like to ask you, which goes back to that famous passage in Acts. When did Ethiopia and Nubia and Egypt become unscrambled in the Greek language? Because remember, the text is in Greek, and it says the Ethiopian queen sent and we know it's Meroe because it's the Kandake, right? But it refers to him as a dark person, as Ethiopian, because that means burnt skin. When did that confluence of, that collation between Nubia and Ethiopia in the Greek language get separated? Do we know?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, not until quite recently. I mean, that quote from Breasted, he's still referring to Nubians as Ethiopians. And that's the thing, when you're reading Herodotus, you have to realize to some extent he's talking about, anybody south, but primarily he's talking about Nubians when he talks about Ethiopians, or Kushites, if you will. So that doesn't get disentangled until really, really late. It still has currency in the early 20th century, even. Although by that time, Egyptologists knew about Kush and Nubia, and they were distinct, but they were still drawing on those kind of classical models.
Was that true of Homer?
Sort of view of the world.
Was that true of Homer too in the Iliad?
If I had to guess, I would say yes, but I don't know for sure. So I'm not a classicist, so although I dabble occasionally, but so I'm not sure. But I would expect that it continued on in later classical sources as well.
When the objects from Reisner's excavations in Nubia came home to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, his assistant Dowse Dunham was the one cataloging all of them. And on the note cards, the primitive database system that was used at the time, on those note cards, Ethiopian was what he put. We had 3 cards for every object, by number, by location, and by catalog orientation. And the term Ethiopian was still used.
That's fascinating. Peter, there was another question for you, Abby, if I may, because I think it's important for you to explain this. And that was about the change of the name of the museum, changing the name Semitic. Would you care to respond to that?
Sure. The Harvard Semitic Museum recently changed its name to the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East. And we fully realize that Near East is a problem, and Stuart referred to that today. By no means are we trying to lift Egypt out of Africa or deny the indigenous nature of the ancient Egyptian population. We felt that Semitic was a confusing term, and most people didn't know what they would see in a Semitic museum. They might have heard the term anti-Semitic, but they didn't really know what Semitic was. And the closest they could come was to think this was a collection of Jewish art, which it isn't. So we tried to cover all of the, or as many of the ancient Near Eastern cultures as we're fortunate to have collections from. So we felt that Museum of the Ancient Near East reflected more the diverse ancient cultures. So Egyptians, Babylonians, Syrians, Philistines, Israelites, as much as we can get in there. So we feel that the name is clearer. It's still not perfect. If you happen to live in China, the Museum of the Ancient Near East may not make much sense to you, but physically the building is located in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So we felt that was the best we could do. And it's very interesting now to see that so many institutions are rethinking these issues. The Oriental Institute in Chicago is discussing their name. ASOR, the American Schools of Oriental Research, is discussing their name. And so I think you may see more changes coming.
So should the art from Egypt and Nubia be in a museum of Near Eastern art or in a museum of African art? Both, neither? Should we duplicate it? I'd really love your take on that. And Stuart, yours too.
Yeah, it's an excellent question and a legitimate one. And you know, if you could fit a logo with that many words and have it still roll off the tongue in some way, that would certainly be desirable. In the department where I teach, the Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations department, we try to define Near East as really quite a broad swath, so all across Northern Africa and all the way to the West. And there is not an effort to somehow obscure the issue or to deny the Africanness of these cultures, as far as I am aware. So that's not the point. But yes, these terms can always be clearer. And if we could write a paragraph and have the name of our museum and include an entire paragraph, I'd certainly love to encompass more of that. Stuart, what do you think?
It's partly an artifact of the compartments, you know, that were created for these different disciplines in the academy. And so we're kind of stuck with some of those, like I mentioned, you know, at the beginning of my talk, this history of Egyptology being drawn into Near Eastern studies. Although I would like, having said that, I would like to see Egypt placed more within African studies without denying the connections with the Middle East. Because you know, in my talk, I didn't mean to deny that there weren't interactions with the Middle East, and there's certainly relationships there. The ancient Egyptian language is related to Semitic languages, but it's also related to a whole constellation of Northeast African languages, something that often gets sort of glossed in this. Right. So, and you know, interdisciplinarity is kind of the watchword these days. And I wonder if we could create a space where, you know, we could not have those hard compartments blocking, you know, things off and putting things into, you know, little containers. And acknowledge, you know, the complexities of what's going on. But I think Egypt should be more prominent in African studies.
For sure. We have the problem with Near East versus Middle East.
Yeah, there's no question of that its location put him at, you know, this ideal crossroads. But the Nile, you know, they looked down toward Khartoum and wanted that water coming, right? And now to Ethiopia, and where it's become quite fraught. So for as much as they were looking east and north, man, their bottom line was to look south toward the equator. And of course, when you ask why does it matter, it matters because for centuries people took Egypt out of Africa. It matters because it was removed from blackness. It was removed from any, you know, they wanted the Egyptians all to look like Cleopatra, who looked like Elizabeth Taylor, and you know, Antony like Richard Burton. So that's why it matters, you know, and because it was an African civilization, without a doubt. But it also was a Mid-Eastern civilization. And when we historicize it, those designations change and shift in emphasis. So I think that's why it's important to do both. And I think that's why your work is of such enormous importance, and you deliver it so eloquently and with such cogency and reliability. So if Abby, if I'm to do this, I'm going to thank our distinguished inaugural Du Bois virtual lecture for a marvelous, marvelous presentation. And I'm applauding on behalf of thousands of people. Well done, my brother.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much.